I got fired immediately after my boss's daughter took over the company. She said, restructuring. So I calmly moved away. What she didn't know that 80% of the company's businesses came from my personal connections. So I made sure she came back begging. Hello. Thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It would be great if you can also comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today, our special shout out goes to Jack Stone from Ohio. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's dive into the details of today's story. I had been with Crestmore Global for over a decade, and in those years, I became more than just an employee. I was the one who brought in new clients, solved fires before they exploded, and handled high-profile accounts that kept the lights on. My office wasn't the biggest, but people knocked before entering. Even the CEO, my boss, treated me with the kind of respect you only get when you're not replaceable. At least, that's what I thought. That illusion shattered the moment his daughter took over. She walked in like royalty, stilettos clicking across the marble floors, wearing her father's last name like a crown and wielding her MBA like a sword. On her second day, she called a meeting with all the department heads. She didn't ask for input. She didn't want to hear stories. She didn't even offer a greeting. She simply opened a folder and said, "Let's talk about restructuring." The air shifted. People stiffened in their seats, trying to make sense of the cold efficiency in her tone. Then she started pointing names out, people she had never spoken to, never evaluated, never watched work, and labeled them non-essential. I was the last name on the list. No explanation, no appreciation. Just, you've been a pillar here, but we need new energy. I didn't flinch, not even a twitch. While others were whispering around the office, watching me for a reaction, I was already packing the few things that mattered to me. A photo of my late father, who taught me to always leave with grace. A leather-bound journal of client notes I kept in shorthand. And a pin, just a cheap black one, but it had been with me through 3 promotions. When she saw me walking out that same afternoon, she didn't even acknowledge me. No handshake. No thank you. Just the sound of her heels echoing in the hall, like she'd already erased my name from the building. The moment I stepped out of the glass doors, the sun hit differently. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even shocked. I was quiet, and in that silence, a strange calm settled in. That kind of calm that only comes when you realize something the other person doesn't. You see, I had built most of the company's revenue base on my back. 80% of our annual income, actually, came from clients I brought in, negotiated with, and personally maintained. But the best part? I'd never signed a non-compete clause. Not once. They assumed I would always be loyal. They assumed wrong. That night, I sat on my balcony with a glass of bourbon in hand, thinking about how quickly things can change. Not out of bitterness, but clarity. I thought about the endless weekends I'd sacrificed, the dinners I canceled, the stress I absorbed to make sure our biggest accounts never left. I remembered solving crises at 2 a.m., guiding junior staff like a second family, and keeping the company's public image spotless while the CEO vacationed in Nice. And now, all that history was replaced by a 28-year-old who thought a rebrand and office bean bags would be enough to drive profits. I slept like a baby. No tossing, no turning. And the next morning, I started writing a list, not of revenge, not of destruction. A list of people, names, relationships, years of loyalty and trust one had built, client by client. I wasn't planning to poach. That wasn't my style. But I knew business. And in business, people follow reliability. They follow someone who picks up the phone when others panic. And soon, those phones were going to start ringing. Not because I called them, but because my absence would be felt like a missing cornerstone in a collapsing structure. There's a certain arrogance that comes with inherited power. She didn't see me as a threat because she never understood what I actually did. She saw titles, not influence. She looked at graphs, not relationships. She thought revenue was just numbers on a dashboard, not people behind them who needed care, reassurance, and consistency. That blind spot would be her undoing. She didn't fire me, she freed me. She gave me time. And the only thing more dangerous than a man with skills is a man with time and nothing left to prove. By the end of that week, I had registered a new business name. Nothing flashy, just clean and sharp. I kept it quiet. No press releases, no fanfare. I updated my LinkedIn headline to something vague. Private consultant, strategic growth advisor. I rented a small office downtown, minimal setup, just me and my laptop. No staff yet. I didn't need noise. I needed space to think. I knew what was coming. It was only a matter of time. But I wasn't going to chase it. No, I was going to sit still and let the empire she thought she ruled start to crumble from the foundation. I didn't send any farewell emails. I didn't clear the air or make a speech. I walked out as if I'd simply gone out for lunch. There was something powerful about leaving quietly. No drama, no parting words, just silence. And in that silence, people started to talk more than I ever could. Rumors swirled in the halls. Why I was gone, what I would do next, whether I'd been pushed or if I'd jumped. It didn't matter. I had no intention of answering any of them. They'd find out in time. And when they did, it wouldn't come from me. I spent the first 3 days organizing my thoughts, not plotting revenge, just evaluating what I'd built while they weren't looking. My network was vast, personal, and strong. Most of my client relationships weren't built in boardrooms. They were born over late-night problem-solving calls, handshakes after saving multi-million-dollar deals, dinners where I talked more about their kids than their portfolios. It wasn't transactional. It was human. And that's something the new management never understood. They thought clients cared about company logos. But people, real people, care about who picks up the phone when things go south. The funny thing is, they thought I had nothing. No office. No staff. No assets. But that was never my power. My leverage wasn't tied to a cubicle or a title. It was in the trust I'd earned. That was something they couldn't fire or restructure away. So I took my time. I didn't rush to call anyone. I didn't post about my departure. I simply observed. Checked in on old friends, sent a few texts, commented on LinkedIn posts here and there. It was subtle, intentional. The first lesson in power: never let them see your full hand too early. On the 4th day, I received a call from an old client, Daniel Webb, CEO of a tech startup we'd onboarded 3 years ago. We hadn't spoken since last quarter. He didn't even know I'd left the company. I just tried to schedule our quarterly strategy session, he said, but they told me you're no longer with Crestmore. What the hell happened? I gave him a calm, polished answer: restructuring. That one word did all the work. There was a pause on the line, then a heavy sigh. You were the only reason we stuck with them through last year's supply chain disaster, he said. Would you consider advising us independently? I told him I'd think about it. But in truth, the decision had already been made. It wasn't about money, it was about momentum. I was still moving forward while they were trying to figure out where all the leaks were coming from. I agreed to take Daniel's company on, but not under my name. I referred him to a brand new consultancy, more in advisory. A quiet brand with a sharp website and a private client portal. No mention of me. Just results. That was the second lesson. Make your moves invisible until they're too big to stop. Over the next 2 weeks, 5 more clients reached out without me lifting a finger. One of them said, "We didn't renew our contract with Crestmore. Frankly, we didn't feel like they had a clue what they were doing after you left." That confirmed it. My value had never been in the reports or quarterly slides. It was in the unspoken assurance that when I was around, they wouldn't drown. Now that I was gone, they were scrambling for a life raft. And I wasn't handing out floats, I was offering an entirely new boat. But I had to be smart. The daughter wasn't stupid, just arrogant. Eventually, she'd start asking questions. Why are clients leaving? Where are they going? Why are the numbers crashing when the branding looks better than ever? She wouldn't understand it immediately. She'd blame marketing, or sales, or the economy. What she wouldn't suspect is that a single exit, the one she orchestrated, was the thread pulling everything apart. And by the time she figured it out, I intended to be too far ahead for her to catch up. I had a rule. I wouldn't chase any client who hadn't come to me first. That way, no one could accuse me of poaching. But I made sure to leave just enough breadcrumbs, congratulatory comments, industry white papers I knew they'd read, a whisper in a networking event that they'd know where to look if they were ready. And most of them were. One client even said, "I wasn't sure if I could reach out to you. I mean, didn't they make you sign a non-compete?" I smiled when I replied, "They forgot that part." The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I'd heard in weeks. I hadn't spoken to anyone from inside Crestmore since I left, but I knew they were watching. I could feel it. The daughter's assistant had viewed my LinkedIn profile twice. The company's legal head had started following my consultancy's page. Subtle moves. Not confrontational. But I knew the signs. They were starting to feel the ripple. They just hadn't realized it was a wave yet. That would come soon enough. By the end of the month, I had 8 active contracts under Morin Advisory. All former Crestmore clients. All signed willingly. All transferred legally. My monthly income had already surpassed my last salary. But more than that, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. Control over my time, my choices, my future. They thought they fired me. But what they really did was release a competitor into the wild. I never liked keeping digital contact lists. I preferred the feel of ink on paper. My old-fashioned black leather Rolodex, each card filled with notes not just about positions and phone numbers, but about birthdays, wine preferences, favorite charities, and names of spouses. People forget that business isn't about transactions, it's about memory. And in a world where CEOs change companies like socks, being the person who remembers that someone's daughter just got accepted into NYU, that builds trust deeper than a pitch ever could. That Rolodex had been my greatest weapon, and now it was time to use it, not aggressively, but intentionally. I started each morning with coffee and 3 cards from the Rolodex. No agenda. No cold calls. I simply reached out with authenticity. Hey, was thinking about you. How's the expansion in Barcelona going? Or, just remember that this month marks your 2nd year since the merger. How are things on your side? The responses were swift, personal, and almost always ended the same way. Where did you land after Crestmore? I didn't sell myself. I just offered an ear. And still, nearly every one of those calls turned into a meeting request. People weren't just curious. They were waiting for a reason to leave. By the end of that week, my calendar was full: breakfast with private equity heads, virtual calls with mid-sized manufacturing CEOs, 2 steakhouse dinners with people I'd worked with through multiple recessions. Some of them had already expressed frustration with the new Crestmore regime. They don't know us, one said. It feels like they're just cycling through strategies they read in a Harvard case study. Another confessed they fired our account manager without a word. We're still waiting on basic data pulls. Honestly, if you're consulting independently, we'd rather move with you. I smiled politely, hiding the fire building behind my calm eyes. I didn't need to pitch. I simply showed up and listened. That was more than Crestmore had done in weeks. Their restructuring had turned a steady ship into a drifting raft. The daughter might have inherited a company, but she hadn't earned loyalty. She replaced it with arrogance and branding campaigns. And branding only works when the product doesn't fall apart under pressure. I knew which clients were loyal to the company and which were loyal to me. And unfortunately for her, that 80% was mine in spirit, even if not yet on paper. I made a decision to onboard only those I could serve deeply. This wasn't about volume. It was about control, precision, and long-term gain. I drafted custom consulting packages tailored to each client's unique pain points. No boilerplate. No slideshows. I gave them something Crestmore couldn't: presence. I took their calls after hours, solved issues in real time, and aligned their strategy with their culture. In return, they didn't just sign contracts. They began referring others. The quiet ones first. The ones who didn't want the noise. The whisper network had begun, and I hadn't said a word publicly yet. Then came the surprise message. A mid-level manager from Crestmore, someone who used to sit in the cube beside mine, sent me a discreet email. Hey, just so you know, there's panic here. The daughter is calling emergency meetings. The revenue drop this quarter is noticeable. They're trying to figure out what's happening. Thought you'd want to know. I stared at the screen for a moment and leaned back, letting it soak in. I hadn't even broken a sweat yet, and the cracks were already visible. I hadn't taken anything from them. They were simply realizing what they'd thrown away. Still, I had to stay 10 steps ahead. No gloating. No social media rants. Just growth. I updated my legal team, ensured all contracts were airtight, reviewed compliance standards, and set up a contingency protocol in case Crestmore tried to retaliate. They hadn't reached out yet, but I knew that would change. When you bleed slowly, the first instinct is to blame the knife you didn't see. And I wasn't hiding. I just wasn't advertising either. My profile was quiet, but active. Strategic, not loud. That's how you win in the long run. Not with noise, but with movement. Some of the newer clients didn't even realize I had once worked at Crestmore. That's how well I had rebranded. I wasn't the guy they fired. I was the advisor who delivers results faster than full teams. They didn't care about my past. They cared that when they called, I picked up. That when they needed a pivot, I mapped it out before the ink dried. Crestmore had offered them a brand. I gave them a brain. The difference was starting to show, and once that difference becomes impossible to ignore, even the skeptics start to shift. It was late one evening, past midnight, when I looked at my whiteboard and realized what I had actually built. Not just a consulting firm, but a network of believers. People who weren't just clients. They were allies. People who had experienced the slow erosion of care in big companies and were now rediscovering the value of working with someone who still treated business as personal. I ran my fingers over the old Rolodex again and smiled. It wasn't just a directory. It was a ledger of loyalty, and Crestmore had no idea what it meant to lose that. I knew she'd reach out soon. She'd try to put a leash on something she no longer controlled. But by then, it wouldn't matter. The exodus had begun, and I wasn't leading it. I was just where everyone naturally landed, because relationships, real ones, don't vanish with a termination letter. They follow the hand that built them. The day my fifth major client signed an exclusive consulting contract with Moore & Advisory, I sat quietly in my home office and stared at the signature line on the PDF. No fireworks. No celebration. Just a long, deep breath. It was a company worth over $18 million in annual revenue, and they just shifted their entire strategy department to me. No board approval. No legal battles. Just a clean exit. The irony? They were one of Crestmore's original accounts, the ones my old boss personally bragged about bringing in, but I was the one who kept them alive all these years. Now they were mine. What I was building didn't feel like a comeback. It felt like a correction. I wasn't trying to destroy anything. I was simply doing what I'd always done, this time without the red tape and bloated structure that slowed everything down. Clients weren't just moving to me for loyalty, they were hungry for clarity, for real-time action, for the feeling that their consultant wasn't waiting for committee approvals or boardroom theater. They wanted someone who remembered how to move, and that was something I hadn't been allowed to do at Crestmore for years. I kept my operations tight. Just me, a contract assistant for scheduling, and a junior analyst I brought on quietly, someone I'd trained personally in the past, someone who knew how I worked and didn't ask unnecessary questions. We didn't rent a glass tower. We operated out of a discreet co-working office, surrounded by startups and freelancers. No press releases, no ribbon cuttings. I didn't need to look successful. I needed to be effective. Every client who came on board received a tailored strategy plan within 72 hours. No fluff, no jargon, just measurable wins. They were shocked by the speed. But I wasn't. This was how it should have been done all along. I also introduced something Crestmore had never offered: discretion, total confidentiality. Clients weren't just moving their business. They were escaping visibility. Big firms often brag about their client rosters for marketing clout. I did the opposite. I promised silence. No names mentioned. No results paraded. It created an atmosphere of trust unlike anything I'd ever seen. CEOs began calling me not just for quarterly advice, but for personal crisis management, investment restructuring, even family business conflicts. And every time I delivered, they told someone else. Quietly, the word spread like a shadow. I never asked for referrals, but they came steadily, like a slow-moving tide. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. An email directly from Crestmore. Not legal, not a PR statement. Her, the boss's daughter. Would you be available for a brief meeting this week? I believe we should talk. No subject line, no formal greeting, just a flat tone that tried to sound indifferent. I read it 3 times, then left it unopened for 2 days. Power isn't about replying fast. It's about making them feel the weight of your silence. On the 3rd day, I replied with one line: Thursday, 9 a.m. My office. And I signed it with my full name and title. Nothing more. When she walked in that morning, dressed in sharp beige with a designer tablet in hand, she looked calm, but her eyes betrayed her. She scanned the modest room, trying to hide her judgment. "This is where you work now?" she asked. I smiled politely. "Yes. Results don't need marble floors." She sat, crossed her legs, and leaned forward. "Let me be direct. We've lost 7 of our top 10 accounts in the last 6 weeks. Most of them have ended up here." I said nothing. She continued, "It's becoming a concern. Our board is restless. Our investors want answers." I watched her squirm for a few more seconds before finally speaking. "I'm not competing with Crestmore. I'm simply doing the work I've always done. The difference is now, I'm appreciated for it." Her lips tightened. "We'd like to offer you a senior partnership, with full control over client strategy. Name on the masthead. Equity options included." I stared at her. It was bold. It was desperate. And it was exactly what I'd been expecting. But the answer had already formed in my head long before she walked through the door. I shook my head slowly. "You didn't lose those clients to me. You lost them the day you stopped listening. The day you thought the title made you competent. You fired the engine of the company and assumed the car would still run." She looked stunned. No one had spoken to her like that before. But I wasn't there to comfort her. I was there to close a chapter. "There's nothing I need from Crestmore, and nothing you can offer that I want." I stood. "I'll walk you out." She hesitated, then rose, clearly shaken. I opened the door for her. She stepped out, not saying another word. As the door closed behind her, I exhaled. Not out of triumph, but finality. I had been tested, not with violence or sabotage, but with the chance to return to something that once defined me. And I said no. That was the moment I knew I had truly moved on. Crestmore wasn't just my past. It was a museum. And I no longer worked in exhibits. I built futures now, one quiet success at a time. It didn't happen all at once. No, companies like Crestmore never collapse overnight. They crumble slowly, piece by piece, from the inside out. Like termites eating through expensive wood, quiet until the structure begins to groan. And that groaning had started. After the failed pitch to bring me back, I expected silence. But instead, the noise began to rise, not from her, but from everywhere around her. Suppliers delayed responses. Investors began skipping meetings. Longtime employees started posting vague LinkedIn updates, coded with frustration. The perfect branding they'd been banking on began to chip under the pressure of actual failure. A week after our meeting, I got a call from a middle manager at Crestmore, someone who'd been loyal to the company for years. "They fired our entire client success department," he said, voice low like he was sharing a secret. "All of them. No warning." She said, "We're going leaner to focus on automation and efficiency. But the truth is, we've got nothing left to manage. All the big accounts are gone." I thanked him for the call and said little more. But I noted it down. Because that's how desperation smells. It's erratic, rushed, and always aimed at the wrong targets. At this point, I had 10 major clients under Moore & Advisory, each from a different sector: finance, logistics, retail, manufacturing, tech, and consulting. What I hadn't expected was that they weren't just hiring me to replace Crestmore's services. They were asking me to build something new. "Can you handle our growth strategy? Would you be willing to guide our board through this merger? Could you train our in-house teams to operate without third-party consultants altogether?" I realized I wasn't just a replacement. I was evolving into a quiet architect. They trusted me not because I was available, but because I'd proven I could deliver under pressure. And with every win, Crestmore grew weaker. The daughter, for all her ambition, didn't understand that power wasn't held in policy. It was held in perception. Her authority had been borrowed, inherited, not earned. And the moment the perception shifted, when clients no longer believed in her vision, her control evaporated. She started pushing out newsletters, hosting webinars, even giving industry interviews. But her words rang hollow. The irony was sharp. The more she tried to appear in control, the more obvious it became she was grasping at whatever image remained of her leadership. Then came the investor meeting leaks. A contact from the private equity firm that backed Crestmore sent me a message. "They're bleeding. 3 major stakeholders are looking to pull out. They're asking tough questions now. About her, about client retention, about you." I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. I hadn't attacked Crestmore. I hadn't run a single ad. All I had done was answer the phone. But now I was being blamed for being who I had always been. And that told me everything. They hadn't lost business because of me. They'd lost business because of who was left after I was gone. That same week, I got a strange request from one of my clients, someone who was still technically under contract with Crestmore for another 6 months. "Can you quietly audit their current strategy?" he asked. "We don't trust what they're telling us anymore." It was a line I hadn't crossed yet, intervening while a contract was still live, but the client had grown tired of waiting for Crestmore to fix what I could solve in a week. I accepted the audit discreetly, and what I found confirmed what I'd suspected. Sloppy frameworks. Poor data hygiene. Zero follow-through. I packaged the results in a clean report, delivered it, and said nothing else. I later heard Crestmore's CMO quit after that report surfaced on the client's board table. Apparently, she was the last one from the old guard still standing. With her gone, the last thread of continuity was severed. Crestmore wasn't just imploding, it was unraveling publicly. Their name still held weight, but not the kind you want. It was the kind that gets whispered in meetings with phrases like, "We should probably avoid working with them until they stabilize," or "We heard they lost over a dozen clients this quarter alone." And that sort of reputation? It doesn't show up in numbers. It shows up in closed doors. Still, I refused to celebrate. I wasn't doing this for vengeance anymore. This was discipline. Crestmore was becoming a case study of what happens when leadership is confused with legacy. She had tried to replace function with flash. She thought the foundation was in the furniture, not in the hands that built the walls. Her team thought I was gone quietly, but what they failed to see was that I didn't leave with noise. I left with the core of the business, quietly, one handshake at a time. By the end of the quarter, I sat down with my analyst and reviewed the numbers. We had quadrupled our original projections. I had to hire 3 more team members. And yet, I kept everything lean, efficient, personal. I didn't want to build another Crestmore. I wanted to build something that would never need a rescue. Something built on trust, not ego. And as I watched another report come in showing that 3 more former clients had filed exit notices from Crestmore, I leaned back and whispered to myself, she thought she was restructuring a company. But all she really did was set me free. It was nearly 6 weeks since I'd last heard from her, and I figured she'd finally accepted the loss. I was wrong. One Thursday morning, I found a printed letter on my office desk, not emailed, not couriered, delivered by hand. The envelope bore no name, just the logo of Crestmore, faded slightly, as if the brand itself was tiring. Inside was a formal invitation. She wanted a second meeting. Not at my office this time, but at a private venue in the city, an old hotel known for discretion and marble silence. The kind of place you go when your public image can't survive another bruise. I arrived early, took a corner seat, and waited. When she walked in, she looked different, not just physically, but like the layers of certainty had been peeled back. Gone were the hard heels and confident smirks. She wore flats. No assistant, no flashy tablet. Just her and a small notepad she didn't open once. She sat across from me and didn't speak for almost a full minute. I could see it all in her eyes, fatigue, pressure, the fragile dance of someone trying to pretend they still had the upper hand. I waited. I wasn't going to break the silence. I'd already won. "I underestimated you," she finally said. I didn't respond. She took a deep breath. "We've lost close to 60% of our recurring revenue streams. Internal morale is down. Investors are threatening to pull out. And I've been advised to," she paused, swallowing the words like broken glass, "consider merger options." That last part hung in the air, heavy and unpolished. It wasn't just a confession, it was a surrender. The empire she thought she could rebuild in her own image was rotting beneath her. She didn't want advice. She wanted salvation. And for the first time, I saw her as she really was, lost. She leaned forward. "You could fix this. If you came back, even temporarily, we could stabilize, rebrand, show the market that there's continuity. We'll give you full autonomy. Title, control, equity, name, whatever you want." It was everything any executive might dream of. But for me, it landed like dust. I didn't need her title. I didn't want my name on the masthead of something that had already sunk. I wasn't here to rescue her from a fire she started. I was here to make sure I never stepped into that house again. "You don't need me," I said slowly. "You need to start over. You've mistaken relationships for leverage. Loyalty isn't built on PowerPoints. It's built on presence. And you killed at the moment you saw people as replaceable data points. She looked down, like my words had cut deeper than she expected. But I didn't stop. Cressmore doesn't need a new face. It needs a soul. And that's not something I can give back. You fired at the moment you walked in with your restructuring list. Her hand trembled slightly. Whether from anger or regret, I couldn't tell. But it didn't matter. I stood to leave. I wish you well, I added. But this story has already ended for me. She didn't follow me out. She didn't say another word. Just sat there, motionless, like a child left at the wrong train station. And I walked out of that marble tomb of a hotel knowing this chapter was finally closed. No vengeance, no anger, just the cold, clear truth that not every story deserves a return. That evening, I received 2 emails back-to-back. One from an investor I'd known during my time at Cressmore. "Smart move," he wrote. "We're out next quarter. Let us know if you're ever raising capital for something more personal." The second was from a current client. "Heard through the grapevine you were approached. Thank you for staying with us." That line sat with me. Thank you for staying with us. It reminded me that while she had offered me a kingdom, I had already built a village of believers, and I wasn't trading them for broken walls and borrowed prestige. Over the next week, news began to leak, quiet at first, then louder. An industry publication hinted at internal financial crises. A prominent LinkedIn post by a former VP mentioned irreversible strategic missteps. Then came the reports. Cressmore was seeking emergency acquisition talks. The same company that once dismissed me with a single sheet of paper was now begging for survival in the same conference rooms I used to command. I read each headline, then closed the browser. I didn't need to archive the fall. I had already written my part. Business at Morin Advisory was thriving. We had just signed a multinational logistics firm and were finalizing a deal with an energy company looking to modernize its internal infrastructure. My team had expanded to 6, and we still hadn't published a single advertisement. Every client came by referral, and every referral began with trust. That was our model. Simple, personal, intentional. The very opposite of what Cressmore had become. We weren't chasing market share, we were earning allegiance. And there's no competitor strong enough to steal that. One evening, while reviewing contracts with my analyst, I looked at the folder where I kept the original termination letter from Cressmore. I hadn't touched it in months. I opened it once more, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder. It wasn't a moment of loss. It was a moment of release. The moment someone else's mistake gave me the space to become exactly who I was meant to be. I always knew it would go public eventually. Stories like mine don't stay in the shadows forever, especially when the cracks become impossible to hide. At first, it was a whisper on industry blogs. A few vague lines and small write-ups. Cressmore Global loses another major client amidst restructuring. No names, no real depth. But then a journalist from a business magazine I'd once spoken to years ago reached out with a direct question. "Can we talk about your transition from Cressmore to Morin Advisory?" Off the record at first. I paused for a moment before replying. I didn't crave headlines. But I knew what this could do for the record, for the legacy, and for everyone who once thought I'd just disappear. We met at a quiet rooftop cafe on the east side of the city. He'd done his homework. He had the numbers, the timelines, even screenshots from former clients praising Morin Advisory's turnaround strategies. But what struck me most was the angle of his questions. He wasn't interested in scandal. He wanted insight. How did you rebuild so quickly? Why didn't you go public with the firing? What does leadership mean to you now, after all this? I answered honestly, without dramatics. I told him I didn't rebuild. I simply continued, but with fewer chains around my decisions. The article dropped 2 weeks later. Front page of the business section. The headline read, "The man who left quietly and took the clients with him." It was crisp, direct, and accurate. The piece painted the full arc. My departure, the silent migration of clients, Cressmore's decline, and Morin Advisory's swift, quiet ascent. It didn't trash the daughter or her leadership directly, but it didn't need to. The contrast was enough. Readers could read between the lines. And it was clear who had stayed standing when the dust began to settle. My phone buzzed nonstop for 2 days after that. Old colleagues, former bosses, former rivals even, all reaching out to either congratulate me or test the waters of future collaboration. I kept responses polite and brief. I wasn't hungry for new attention. I was focused on preserving what had already been built. Still, I understood what the article had done. It wasn't just validation. It was exposure. And with exposure comes a different kind of power, the kind you no longer have to reach for because it comes to you. But it also brought new tension. I received a cease and desist threat from Crestmore's legal department claiming defamation, even though I hadn't said a single negative word in the piece. The article spoke for itself. I forwarded it to my legal counsel, who responded on my behalf with a single sentence: "Truth requires no apology." I heard nothing else after that. Their silence confirmed what I already knew. They were playing defense. And you don't sue someone when the only damage is the truth. Clients started referencing the article in meetings. "I read about your journey," one CEO said. "It reminded me that leadership isn't about inheriting a role. It's about earning followership." Another said, "After reading your story, I realized we've been tolerating mediocrity. Time to shake things up." These weren't just compliments. These were conversions. Clients weren't choosing me out of sympathy. They were inspired by the clarity of what had unfolded. The story gave them permission to rethink what they were settling for. And I became the proof that better was possible. The most surreal moment came during a panel event I hadn't planned to attend. A friend of mine, who was moderating, pulled me into the audience and introduced me mid-session. "I think we should hear from someone who didn't just survive corporate betrayal, but used it as fuel to create something better." All eyes turned to me. I stood slowly, nodded once, and shared just one sentence. "Sometimes being pushed out of a building is the only way to realize you can fly." The room fell quiet. No applause. Just a slow, collective breath, like everyone knew exactly what I meant. After that event, we received 12 new inquiries in 3 days. 8 converted into contracts. My analyst joked, "At this point, they're coming to you like you're a lighthouse in a storm." I didn't laugh. Not because I didn't appreciate the metaphor, but because I finally understood what I had become. Not a competitor. Not a consultant. A signal. A living example that the best revenge isn't destruction, it's distinction. The kind that doesn't need a pitch. Just presence. In the quiet of my office, I sometimes stared at the framed article on the wall. Not because I needed to relive it, but because it reminded me of what matters, not how loudly you fall, but how gracefully you rise. I didn't scream when they pushed me out. I didn't demand attention. I simply moved forward with precision, with consistency, with dignity. And now, every call I received was proof of that choice. She had tried to erase me from the story, but in trying to remove my name, she accidentally gave me the entire narrative. It was a cool Friday evening when I received a call from a young entrepreneur named Felix. Barely 30, eager, and clearly navigating his first round of startup funding. He'd read the article, heard the stories, and said he'd followed every move I made since Morin Advisory launched. "You're the reason I didn't give up on my idea," he told me. "I thought if someone could walk away from a giant and still win, then maybe I had a shot too." I leaned back in my chair, listening. I could hear the same fire I once had, buried under the noise of proving yourself in a world that only values titles. Felix wanted mentorship, not just consulting. Not money, just time. Someone to show him what the books wouldn't. And I said yes. Not because I needed the recognition, but because I remembered what it felt like to have no map and no one willing to say, "I've been there." For the first time since leaving Crestmore, I realized the true value of everything I'd built wasn't in revenue or reputation. It was an impact. Quiet, unmarketed, personal impact that had a ripple effect far beyond contracts and headlines. I invited Felix to shadow me for a week. He sat through strategy sessions, watched how I negotiated, how I asked questions, how I listened. On the last day, he looked at me and asked, "What was the moment you knew you'd made it?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know, but because it was never just one moment. It was a series of small confirmations, a client choosing me again, a colleague sending quiet praise, my team solving problems without me watching. And then I said, "It's not about making it. It's about making peace with where you are and choosing to stay true to what got you there." That evening, I pulled out the old leather Rolodex again. It was worn now, the edges soft, the ink faded. I flipped through the names, smiling at the connections, the stories behind each one. Some had retired. Some had moved across the world. Some had become family. That little book had built an empire far larger than the building I once worked in. Not because it was filled with power players, but because it held trust. The kind you can't buy. The kind you can't fake. The kind you only get by showing up consistently, humbly, and delivering over and over again. Word eventually got out that Crestmore was being acquired in pieces. Not a graceful merger. A salvage operation. What remained was absorbed by a larger competitor, and the name Crestmore Global was retired, quietly removed from signage and websites like it had never existed. No final announcement. No thank you to employees. Just silence. The same silence they once used to dismiss me. And yet, I felt no satisfaction in watching it disappear. It wasn't about them anymore. It never truly was. The best revenge had already been lived, day after day, client after client. In the final month of that fiscal year, Moore & Advisory crossed the $12 million revenue mark. We had 12 core clients, a team of 10, and a waitlist. Not because we were exclusive, but because we refused to grow faster than we could sustain excellence. Every member of my team knew the story. Not as folklore, but as a warning. Never confuse scale with value. Never forget the hands behind the numbers. We didn't chase growth. We earned trust. And that trust, once established, became the most unshakable foundation I'd ever stood on. I looked out my window that night, sipping a quiet drink, and thought back to the moment I was fired. The coldness of that office. The silence that followed. The way no one stood up for me, not because they didn't care, but because they were scared. And I forgave them. All of them. Even her. Because now I understood. Some people build legacies. Others inherit buildings. She never stood a chance against someone who had lived every lesson she skipped. And I never needed to crush her. I just needed to continue. And I did, on my own terms, at my own pace, with my name still intact. So if you ask me what this story is about, it's not revenge. It's not business strategy. It's not even about being right. It's about what happens when you stay grounded in your craft, when you don't react out of ego but respond with excellence. I never wanted to destroy anything. I just wanted to be free. And when that freedom came disguised as a termination letter, I embraced it. I didn't burn the bridge. I didn't need to. I simply built a better road. And every day since, others have chosen to walk that road with me. If this story kept you engaged till the end, don't just scroll away. Like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Subscribe for more powerful narratives that remind us how quiet strength and smart moves often speak louder than noise. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. See you soon in our next story.